Whoa, that's like so meta. It's Blaster Master on episode 94 of NES Works. Somewhere amidst the big autumn rush for NES in the fall of 1988, Sunsoft decided to elevate its game. After subsisting on creaky arcade ports, the company finally took a look at the likes of Super Mario Bros. 2, Zelda 2, and BIONIC Commando and said, yeah, we can do that too. And they did. Blaster Master feels like one of those games that just kind of showed up out of nowhere. With surprisingly sophisticated design sensibilities, mind-blowingly good audio and graphics, and wildly ambitious multi-format play. All from a company no one ever had a reason to bother to pay attention to before now. The most interesting thing Sunsoft had published for NES before this had been Freedom Force, a decent light gun game with a stunning cinematic opening and content that felt like it ran out about halfway through the intended game. With Blaster Master, the company seemingly skipped a step of design evolution and advanced directly to Go to collect their $200. Sunsoft instantly went from middling peddler of aging arcade ports to purveyor of tentpole third-party releases. The kind of company that kept the NES alive and thriving as Nintendo's own internal lead development resources increasingly focused on Game Boy and Super Famicom now that Super Mario Bros. 3 had launched in Japan. Not every Sunsoft game from this point on would necessarily be amazing, but they'd invariably be great to look at and listen to in a way that did a lot to wallpaper over the rough patches in gameplay. Now, over on the Japanese side of things, Sunsoft had developed its bona fides for years. The company began producing arcade machines in the late 1970s as one of many corporations that shifted their focus away from their original remit, in this case, textile and electronics manufacturing, in order to seize on the invaders boom. The company wouldn't land its first proper hit for a few years, though, with the arrival of the Donkey Kong-inspired KANGAROO, a game that almost, rumor has it, made its way to NES courtesy of HAL. KANGAROO became a modest arcade hit, and its Atari home conversion sold like gangbusters. When the Famicom boom replaced the Invaders boom, Sunsoft shifted their focus to that new platform with arcade conversions like Super ARABIAN and Iki. Those sold so well that the company redoubled its focus on the console by creating new games for it, each one increasingly epic. There was the infamous Atlantis no NAZO, a game designed to be bigger and more mysterious than Super Mario Bros. By incorporating 100 stages instead of 32 and loading them down with baffling, unfriendly secrets. And there was the Wing of MADOOLA, a sprawling, albeit messy action RPG in the Dragon Buster vein. Sunsoft also published adventure and puzzle games for Famicom Disk System, with each new release honing the internal dev team's skills. By the time Blaster Master arrived in Japan under the name Cho Wakusei Senki Metafight, Sunsoft's staff, working under the name Tokai Engineering, had honed its collective skill to stand among the best of the best among the Famicom pantheon. Blaster Master, of course, did not invent multi-genre gameplay. It doesn't contain half as many alternate play modes as Golgo 13 by Vic Tokai, no relation to Tokai Engineering, although it certainly does contain twice as much polish. Blaster Master's core gameplay combines platform-based vehicular shooting, think Contra meets City Connection, while its alternate mode adopts a top-down view that comes across as a hybrid of The Legend of Zelda and Commando. Although a few infuriating design decisions prevent the latter portion from being as enjoyable as the former, all in all, the sum of these parts adds up to a true NES classic. In perhaps a sign of the times, however, Metafight sold for crap in Japan. Despite its explosive audio-visual excellence and on-trend packaging, the Famicom audience took an indifferent approach to the game, and it quickly sank its way off the sales charts. The days of guaranteed million sellers for Famicom had long since ended. By mid-1988, the market had become saturated with games for the system and for Disk System, while NEC's powerful PC engine was ascendant, and Sega's mighty Mega Drive lurked in the wings. There's no justice to a world where a crummy port of Iki sells 30 to 40 times as well as Metafight, and yet that was the nature of the Famicom market by this point. Luckily for Sunsoft's bottom line, the American NES market beckoned from across the Pacific. Sunsoft touched up Metafight for US release, renaming it Blaster Master and tweaking a couple of particularly frustrating level design choices to be less punishing. Otherwise though, the US release came through almost entirely identical to the Famicom version, which set it apart from heavily reworked or censored contemporaries like Mario 2, Zelda 2, BIONIC Commando, and Castlevania 2. The American branch of Sunsoft requested only one significant change: a new story. Metafight had told a cosmic sci-fi tale about a man tasked to take down an enemy legion on the planet Sophia 3 with the use of an advanced combat tank. Blaster Master is about a kid who wants to find his lost pet frog, which has no bearing on the gameplay but required the creation of an entirely new opening cutscene graphic. Where the Japanese version simply opens with a title screen that cuts immediately to a scene of the player's vehicle zooming into action, the US release now presents the lead-in via silent slideshow. Now the player takes the role of a boy named Jason, whose pet frog, Fred, leaps out of Jason's hand and into his backyard. Somehow, Fred manages to stumble into an open barrel of nuclear waste that Jason's family was storing back there, which causes Fred to grow instantly to immense size. In an understandable panic at this turn of events, Jumbo Fred falls down a deep chasm beside the nuclear waste barrel in Jason's backyard. Jason, who cares far more about his unwilling pet than he is for his own safety, recklessly leaps after the enormous amphibian and plunges into a cavern deep beneath the earth. Luckily for Jason, he lands on the hard, rocky soil without a scratch and finds a super-powered, all-terrain combat tank waiting for him there. Donning the tank's pilot suit, which perfectly fits him, he powers up the combat machine and jets off in search of his frog. This is perhaps the most nonsensical storyline ever to grace a video game. But who's to say Sunsoft of America was wrong to demand their co-workers at Tokai Engineering incorporate these changes? Blaster Master sold something like 20 times as well in the US as on Famicom, and its success inspired several sequels, multiple remakes, and even tie-in media. Of course, Blaster Master had a few factors working in its favor that Metafight did not. I'm going to go out on a limb and speculate that the game's extensive, explosive coverage in the extremely well-read first few issues of Nintendo Power worked a lot more in its favor than a goofy cutscene about a teenager's mutant ninja amphibian. So, what did Nintendo Power say? Quite a lot, actually. Blaster Master only received a passing mention in the first issue, but issues 2 and 3 had extensive coverage of the game that did a lot to build its hype. Volume 2 devoted a pair of 2-page spreads to the game. These didn't really give much of a sense of how the game played or what players needed to do, but they showcased the impressive visuals, which made for a pretty good hook. Volume 3 downshifted to a lower gear and presented several pages of play descriptions, screenshots, and stage maps to help paint a more concrete picture of the adventure. The third issue also featured Blaster Master as its fold-out map, with gorgeous miniature photography of a custom-made metal attacker model that looked like something out of Thunderbirds. Oh, and issue 6 introduced the world to the all-important grenade pause trick, without which many of us would never have seen beyond stage 3 or 4. Anyway, back to Blaster Master. Frogs and magazines spreads aside, Blaster Master's greatest advantage came from being a generally brilliant game in all its versions. The US version simply had the distinct advantage of launching in a territory whose console market hadn't yet reached saturation point. Certainly, NES fans already had a fair few games of this quality to choose from, but not so many that a brilliantly crafted instant classic like this would simply slip past without notice. The game's combination of mechanics and features, while not without its shortcomings, created a unique play experience that set Blaster Master apart. Players take charge of a surprisingly nimble tank called... No, actually it doesn't have a name in the US version. The Japanese game called it the Metal Attacker, but the NES manual didn't give it a name. American fans assumed it was called Sophia III based on the subscreen, which depicts a schematic of the tank with the name Sophia 3 underneath it. In reality, that's simply a leftover from the Japanese release where the action took place on the third planet in the Sophia system, which was itself an oblique reference, along with the title Chowakusei Senki Metafight, to an early Sunsoft game called Dai-San Wakusei, or the Third Planet. Of course, Blaster Master takes place on Earth, or at least a version of Earth where little kids live in homes plagued by stray nuclear waste and fissures leading to vast underground structures. But regardless of the setting, the Metal Attacker can perform a remarkable variety of feats. It can roll, leap, shoot, and fire alternate weapons. Players control the tank with tight controls, and it responds brilliantly, with probably the best physics yet to appear on NES outside of the Super Mario games. The acts of jumping and rolling convey a convincing sense of inertia thanks both to the metal attacker's responsiveness and some brilliant animation that uses the motion of the tank's wheels and the impression of shock absorbers to give the machine every bit as much of a personality as Clarice's cartoonish Honda City in City Connection. The tank comes factory standard with a forward cannon that can also be fired directly upward, an action that lends to the metal attacker's charm as it extends itself upward to aim overhead. The tank's capabilities don't end there, however. Over the course of the adventure, you collect a variety of secondary weapons and permanent upgrades. Secondary weapons grant you powers like homing missiles and a tremendous lightning strike that passes downward through the floor to fry enemies beneath you, albeit somewhat unreliably. While limited in uses, refills for each of these weapons appear in the form of capsules that show up randomly upon destroying enemies, or scattered throughout the world. The permanent upgrades, on the other hand, require a lot more searching. One of these exists to be found in each of the 7 areas leading up to the final stage, and each one extends the abilities of the metal attacker more than it does the combat abilities. Sure, you have the hyper and crusher beams that you acquire in areas 1 and 2 and simply make the cannon stronger, but beyond that, the powers you collect allow the metal attacker greater mobility. Foremost among these are the hover and dive upgrades you earn in level 3 and 5, which give you the ability to travel into new spaces. The hover power has limited range determined by a meter that depletes as you fly, but it effectively grants the metal attacker the ability to lift off and fly at will. The dive power allows you to move more freely underwater. Rather than rolling sluggishly, you can simply tuck the tank's wheels up into its undercarriage to transform it into a submarine that can zip around in the water. You can also acquire the ability to climb walls and roll along ceilings with 2 late-game upgrades. All of these powers, as well as the rather prosaic Area 4 upgrade, the Key, effectively function as keys to grant you access to new spaces. You see, Blaster Master presents a new take on, yes, the Metroidvania format. In fact, I would go so far as to say that it contains the most enjoyable interpretation of the concept seen to this point on NES. The secret to its success lies in its structure, which falls somewhere between Metroid and Mega Man. As in Metroid, Blaster Master's world consists of separate but interconnected regions. Although the game unfolds along a distinct critical path, you often need to backtrack to earlier portions of the world in order to find the route that leads further into the underground. However, Blaster Master sets itself apart by removing the ambiguity from that critical path. Unlike Metroid, the Goonies 2, or RYGAR, you never find yourself wandering around Blaster Master wondering where the next upgrade is or where you need to return to in order to advance. The early game gating makes it pretty easy to remember where to return to make connections to later areas, with conspicuous spaces and tells that stick in the mind of any curious tank commander who wonders, for example, how to clear that one big wall, or where the tiny tank-sized path lined with spikes leads to. More importantly, the design and layout of each level work together to funnel you toward that area's upgrade. Here's where the Mega Man comparison comes into play. Each stage contains a single upgrade, and to acquire that upgrade you need to defeat a boss. You need to do some searching and exploring to actually figure out where the boss resides, but once you've destroyed it and collected its prize, you'll have concluded your work in that level. In other words, Blaster Master leaves you with no uncertainty about your tasks. Enter area, find boss, kill boss, use new power to reach next area. It's a lean, almost arcade-style approach to the Metroidvania concept. Indeed, Sunsoft developed, but never released, a slightly stripped-down conversion of Blaster Master for Nintendo's coin-op versus system. It neatly balances the trend of rambling, exploratory gameplay that hadn't yet taken hold on the Famicom and NES with quality-of-life design considerations that hadn't yet trickled into the collective game design conscious. I'd almost be tempted to say Blaster Master contains the best Metroidvania experience to be found on NES, period. Not just to this point, but overall. If not for a single critical issue, you don't always ride around with the metal attacker. At first glance, this makes for a pretty neat little addition. The metal attacker simply won't fit into some spaces, but a simple press of the select key causes Jason to hop out of the tank and get about on foot. The metal attacker's sprite seems about the same size as your standard NES character sprite, and Jason shows up to scale. That is to say, he's almost comically tiny, a diminutive little pipsqueak who looks almost entirely helpless in a tank-scaled world. Enemies tower over him, and even the most basic platforms present too large an obstacle for him to scale himself. The play mechanics reflect this disparity. Jason has a weapon that he can fire while exploring on foot, but it packs a comically pathetic punch that essentially glances off enemies as they stomp all over him. It's a neat concept that opens up the possibility of some inventive puzzle-based level design, but unfortunately outside of Area 5, where you have to swim around as Jason before you can get the dive upgrade for the metal attacker, Blaster Master doesn't really take it in that direction. Instead, Jason mainly treks on foot in the wide-open tank-sized spaces in order to make his way to an alternate gameplay mode built around his proportions. On its surface, this works a bit like Tecmo's NES port of RYGAR. Gameplay alternates between side-scrolling action and top-down combat, the core mechanical concepts carrying over between the two but functioning differently. In the Jason mode, you can't jump or use any of the metal attacker's powers. Instead, combat plays out a little like Ikari Warriors or Commando. You can shoot, and you can toss grenades. Like in those games, though, the top-down sequences don't strictly scroll in a single direction. Top-down sections consist of multiple interconnected rooms that form a maze-like network, which area has several of these Jason-sized labyrinths, one of which houses both the level's boss and the power-up it protects. In fact, all boss encounters take place in these spaces, which seems like something of a waste. The metal attacker gains an impressive succession of new abilities, but never really faces anything deadlier than the giant angry face that blocks the path to Area 2. Meanwhile, Jason is stuck with his pea shooter and short-range grenade, and never gains permanent power-ups. Yet he's the one who has to deal with the big bad guys, including the utterly brutal final boss gauntlet. Even that wouldn't be so awful if not for a single infuriating design choice. While Jason never acquires permanent weapon or health upgrades, he can power up his pistol through 8 different stages of strength. While his base weapon is utter garbage, his maxed out pistol tears through everything in its path. Unfortunately, these pistol upgrades are precisely the opposite of what you might call permanent. Easy come, easier go. Anytime Jason suffers damage from an enemy in top-down mode, he loses both health and a level of weapon upgrade power. It takes some time to build up a full weapon upgrade, but you can easily go from max power to base power in what seems like a matter of seconds. The game penalizes you for taking damage by removing some of your power, making you even more susceptible to further enemy attacks. Losing power and health really drags the game down, especially where bosses are concerned. And the bosses pose a massive threat, hitting hard, crowding the player, and absorbing a ton of shots. They pose a reasonable but decidedly non-trivial threat for a fully powered up Jason, but the instant you take a hit, you become locked into a downward spiral of failure that will eventually lead to your demise. You can exit the boss room when you start your next life and go foraging for gun upgrades, but those tend to be scattered far and wide. In many cases, powering up means returning to the tank, driving to another location, and fighting through a top-down zone where power-ups are stashed, which amounts to a 10-minute ordeal just to grind up enough gun power to face the boss again, assuming you don't lose those gun pickups along the way, or die, which causes your gun power to return to 0. Between the 3/4 perspective that can make collision boundaries between Jason and the hazards around him ambiguous, and the fact that the top-down areas are riddled with infinitely spawning enemies that zip around in hard-to-hit patterns from all directions, these top-down sequences are absolutely exhausting. It greatly undermines the game's appeal, turning the critical encounter spaces into grueling gauntlets, where the slightest misstep or failure to take down a single one of the infinite enemies that patrol the top-down zones leaves you debilitated and vulnerable. On top of that, the US version of Blaster Master limited the number of continues available, to make the whole thing even more cruel. I can speak from hard-earned experience that few video game scenarios feel quite so demoralizing as fighting all the way to the plutonium boss only to die and see that final no continues game over screen. With a few simple tweaks to make these sequences less punishing, say doling out weapon upgrades less frequently, and resetting them in each new area rather than punishing Jason for every point of damage he takes, Blaster Master would work a lot better. We've seen this philosophy in action time and again actually, as the game has been remade several times over the years for Game Boy Color, WiiWare, and Switch. Each new version focuses the majority of its revisions on the mechanics of the top-down zone, with Inti Create's Blaster Master Zero finally figuring out the logistics so effectively that they could justify creating multiple direct sequels. Back on NES, however, the Jason sequences drag down an absolute masterpiece of a game to mere flawed genius status. That still puts it in the upper percentile of NES games, admittedly. Blaster Master fared well enough in the US that the property lived on in various forms. A few sequels appeared over the years on other platforms, including a rebranded Game Boy sequel to Robo Warrior that continued the bizarre trend of localizers pretending portable Bomberman-related games were something else. A Worlds of Power kids-sized novelization showed up as part of that book series, and that book's narrative served as the basis for a late-era PlayStation sequel called Blaster Master Blasting Again. More recent efforts like Blaster Master Zero have spent a great deal of energy trying to reconcile the goofy narrative threads established by the NES game's plot and this ancillary media work. As for the original game itself, it holds a dear place in the hearts of many NES fans. But Blaster Master Zero largely moots it by overhauling the weapon degradation system. Look beyond this fundamental balancing flaw, however, and you have the biggest and best structured Metroidvania yet seen on NES, a game whose concepts and influence would eventually even circle back around to help inspire Super Metroid and Castlevania. You know, Metroidvania. Also this month, we see the last of the officially licensed Tengen products. Although I originally grouped these games with NES Works 1987 due to their uncertain release dates, at this point, we've locked down the fact that these games definitely shipped between July and October of 1988. In fact, they received fairly extensive coverage in early issues of Nintendo Power. Gauntlet received a massive dedicated spread, and RBI Baseball appeared as part of a baseball shootout alongside Bases Loaded and MLB in issue 1. But sometime between the October launch of Gauntlet and the 1989 arrival of Tengen's version of Tetris, the company, a splinter of Atari Corp., figured out a way to bypass Nintendo's lockout ship, earning themselves a place on Nintendo's no-fly list for retailers. Their approach did not strictly fall within the bounds of legality, which is a big part of why you stopped seeing the Tengen name on shelves a short way into the 1990s as the company went bankrupt. But it did create a parallel history of NES games whose existence Nintendo prefers to sweep under the rug. This revisionism includes Gauntlet, RBI Baseball, and the original release of Pac-Man. Despite all three appearing in Nintendo Power and shipping in packages that bore the Nintendo seal of quality, they no longer appear on Nintendo's official NES documentation. This has the curious side effect of erasing the first ever NES title to have been fully developed in the US by a US company, Gauntlet. For the moment, though, by which I mean the holiday season of 1988, American kids could happily buy all three of these games from future revolutionary firebrands Tengen at any old store. Beyond here, however, Tengen would become a fixture of rental shops and mom-and-pop NES retailers, rare sights to be traded furtively between savvy fans in dim parlors and back alleys. Next time on NES Works, Capcom makes war reparations.